Australia is a big country. Australia is also a land shaped by wildfire in many places. Join me as we travel around this great country, meeting people and talking with them, and together their stories will come together and help us better explain Australia's complex relationships with wildfire. Welcome to Talking Wildfire Australia, my friends. Hi and welcome. Today we're here with Phil Cheney and we're talking about the basics of firefighting so that everybody can understand a lot easier. We're going to talk about first what fires are, and then we'll go into a little bit more concepts about how we actually fight fires on a larger scale. Phil, can you tell us a little bit about fires?
Well, we're talking about something that people are less and less familiar with. We can start with the campfire, which people use, and here's a campfire. The campfire is, if you want it fast, you put in fine fuel. If you want it to last long, you then add heavy fuels to it. The difference between a campfire and a forest fire or a wildfire is that the fire is burning in much the same way, except that the fire is continually moving into new fuel as it spreads.
Phil, what would you like people to know about fire?
Well, I'd like them to understand that fire, and in any environment in the world which is flammable, fire is a natural phenomenon. When we look at these trees around us, we are looking at something is constructed by a chemical reaction where carbon dioxide from the air, water from the ground, and energy from sunlight on the leaves, a chemical reaction that produces carbohydrates and other organic chemicals which form the body of these trees that we see around us. Now, a fire is the reverse of that reaction. The fire takes the carbohydrates and the cellulose that is produced in the vegetation and it combines it with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water.
Phil, that makes sense to me as a firefighter. If we wanted to explain to people about what the fire triangle is, can you explain that to us more simply?
Sure. The fire triangle identifies the three basic parts which are controlling the combustion process. First, you have the fuel on the bottom that is there to provide the source of energy. You have oxygen on one side, which is necessary to combine with the fuel. And on the third side, you have heat. And the heat is required for ignition and also to sustain the process.
And on the fire triangle, if you take out one side of the fire triangle, will the fire stop?
Well, yes, if you take out the oxygen, the fire stops immediately and all of the process eventually stops. If you take away the fuel, then, of course, there's nothing to provide the energy. The fire stops. The heat is a little different because the heat is required first to start the fire, and as a natural phenomena, the heat is provided by lightning. As a man-made phenomena, it's provided by all sorts of sources, some deliberate, some completely accidental, but there has to be a source of ignition to get the fire. The heat is necessary for the speed of the reaction. And that's where in our fuel, the heat output is controlled by the moisture content of the fuel.
Okay, Phil, could you tell us a little bit more about how that works?
Well, if we take green leaves like we see around us, they have a moisture content of around about 100% or somewhat greater. That means that the weight of water in the leaf is equal to the weight of the leaf. Now, as the leaf dries out, then it starts losing the moisture, which is called the foliar moisture, and that's mostly water which was within the cells of the leaf structure, which performs the process of photosynthesis. This dries out. This has to dry out first before the leaf can burn. And so heat is required to do that, or over a long period, it dries out under ordinary temperatures. The other moisture is held within the fibre structure of the leaf itself. And this is the fibre moisture content. And once the cellular moisture has gone, the fibre moisture content is controlled by the rainfall, or more commonly when it's dry, the relative humidity in the air.
And that means the amount of moisture that's in the air around us.
That's right. And it's called the relative humidity. When the relative humidity is 100%, water starts to precipitate out of the air and you get fogs and rain clouds forming and rain. And it drops to around about, let's say,
75%.
when the leaf will burn, but it burns slowly. And this is part of the process that we use to control fires of different intensity, or prescribe fires of different intensity. When it's very dry and the humidity is down, say,
15%.
and that's a very hot, dry day, all the moisture is gone. You'll notice if you're in those conditions, and you will have noticed that as a firefighter, Mike, under those conditions, you, as a functioning body, you have to use water to keep you cool. And so you're perspiring water. For the leaf becomes so dry that it is very easily ignited, and it burns very quickly because there is no water available to modify the process.
Phil, could you tell us a little bit about how the fire triangle relates to the concept of firefighting and what we're actually doing out there?
Well, really, when we're firefighting, we have to look at the options. What can you do to put out a fire? You can remove the oxygen. Now, you can do that in a small fire. in a laboratory or in a house, or where you can put a blanket over it and you can smother it and put the oxygen out, so a fire on the stove, that can be done, removing the oxygen. Out in the field, in the world we're in here, you're not going to remove the oxygen, it's everywhere, but you can add water, you can cool it down, so you can lower the temperature of the combustion process to a point where it's not sustainable. This has to be done much more intensely than most people appreciate, and I'll come back to that. The best thing you can do is to remove the fuel. And really, that's how we have to stop fires. We have to remove the fuel so the process of combustion does not keep spreading into new fuel. And this is done by making a bare earth barrier, and I emphasize the bare earth because under really dry conditions, the combustion is so efficient that it burns material which is in the upper soil layers, the duff and combustion, which often people don't realise is burning. There are roots close to the surface and large logs. The bare earth trail has to completely surround the fire so that combustion can't spread into new fuel. The point that I said we have to come back to is that we see the flames, a lot of people see the flames are put out, yay, the fire's over. No, not necessarily. The large fuels, fire may burn inside logs, often for several days, as smouldering combustion deep inside the crevices of logs. It can burn in roots close to the ground. And so a firefighter has to then face up to extinguishing the fire, the combustion in the logs, and it's called mopping up. They have to go around. Mostly water is used for this to cool it down. Often the logs have to be broken up, but the aim is to break the fire triangle completely, and then you have a good hope of putting the fire out and keeping it out.
Phil, I know a lot of people believe that fires just explode alive and they're exploding gases in different places. Can you explain a little bit about how fires actually spread throughout a forest or a wild area?
Mike, that's one hell of a question. I can't. I can only start to address it. As I said, fire is a chemical reaction. The process of the fuel breaking down, becoming into a flammable gas, combining with oxygen on the outside, is a turbulent process. It's very much mixed up. It's hard to describe without looking at some burning materials, without looking at what the flames do. All of our fires produce what's called diffusion flames. Now, as the carbohydrate in the fuel breaks down, the first process is breaking down into more combustible products. And these are, comes in gases like ethane and methane are formed along with a multitude of other products. it's a turbulent process. It's a chaotic process. And so you have a whole bunch of chemicals in this gas bubble that is produced exuding from the fuel layer. And the oxygen combines with it on the surface of the gas layer. And that's pretty easy. You can take an old-fashioned cigarette lighter and light it, and you'll see a yellow flame. And what that is doing, it is combining in the oxygen around the gas. The oxygen and the gas are burning at an interface around the edge of that gas ball. Now, in very high intensity fires, a lot of gas is produced. And these can break away from the source, and they can go up in the air, and they can reignite. And so you can get separation within the flames. Mostly they're turbulent and boiling over each other, but at times you do get gas balls. But they come from the combustion process. They can't be sustained for very long because the gas either becomes too dilute, it's mixed with oxygen that doesn't ignite, or it just disperses.
Phil, I've seen on a lot of forest fires and bushfires that I've been on, fires spreading out. And can you explain to our viewers what is needed for a fire to continually spread?
Well, firstly, it needs continuous fuel. There are natural barriers. You've got the edge of Australia, you've got the ocean. Inside you've got lakes, you've got rivers, you've got roads. There are natural and artificial barriers where fuel is interrupted. If there is no wind, the fire will burn in a circle, and it will spread slowly but evenly in all directions. If the terrain is flat, then you'll end up with a circle. If the terrain is sloping, then the convection of the fire tends to drag it up the slope in what's called an elliptical form. And it forms an ellipse as it's running up the slope. But mostly it's the wind, and the wind is a critical factor in high intensity fires. And it's the recent fires in Maui were driven by a hurricane. They started in grasslands and old cane fields and burnt into a suburban area where the fuel was basically the houses in the suburban area. And because the wind was so strong, there was no way in the world anything could stop it. It just drove the fire through the fuel until it ran into the ocean where the fuel ran out. On the upwind side, the fire is edging slowly back against the wind. And that's where it's easiest to put out, because the separation of the fuel can be a pretty narrow barrier that you can work. And as a firefighter, you would know when you're facing hot fires, you start often, the best point to start is an anchor point at the base of the fire on the upwind side. So you're attacking the slowest moving, safest part of the fire and extinguish it, and working forwards towards the main head fire. But wind is what drives the fire. The wind, the fuel, the structure of the fuel, the structure of the forest in forest fires are factors which combine with each other to produce different fire behaviour in different vegetation types under different conditions. So all of these have to be taken into account.
Phil, we've talked about a lot of concepts for our viewers about firefighting, and to explain back with the fire triangle, to pull everything together, can you tell us a bit about when people are watching television or out on a fire and they see the aircraft working? What basically would you say the air bombers are doing, or air tankers, and what are the helicopters doing? They're doing different tactics, but can you explain for our viewers what the tactics are?
Well, the tactic basically is to apply one of the legs of the fire triangle. Now, they can't reduce the oxygen by and large. They can't do that. But they can reduce the heat by dropping water directly on the fire. And if the fire is small, that may be enough to extinguish the flames over the whole area of the fire. Often what it doesn't do, though, is extinguish the fire completely, which means you still need that mopping up process to provide a barrier from the fire spreading from the combusting area in the logs and in under the ground to the new fuel outside where the water drop was.
So you need people on the ground.
You need people on the ground. You need still to form that bare earth barrier around the fire.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it can be also used to provide a barrier. And once a fire is of a certain size, that's basically all they can do. And it will be like providing any other barrier. It only works to stop the fire if it not only suppresses the flames, but it is of sufficient width that sparks and firebrands don't blow beyond it to continue fires. And in this way, it's not all that much different in what it can do compared with a crew with a bulldozer constructing a line in front of the fire. That width is only good enough if it's wide enough to stop the firebrands, the sparks being blown by the wind over the break. It's mostly effective along the flanks or the backs of the fire, where it's wide enough to reduce the heat by the water or the fire retardant applied, that also. But again, it's rare that it can be complete enough to coat all the fuel within the area of the drop. So it also mostly will only slow the fire for a while, unless it's a fire of fairly low intensity. And really, again, to ensure that the fire is out, it should be followed up by on-the-ground firefighters.
And with this concept, the air tankers, when we use them, you'll see them dropping a pink colored, or it could be a white chemical out of them. What they're doing a lot of times is they're painting, we call it. They're actually creating line around the fire, just like what Phil just said, and that becomes a barrier. And that's one of the tactics we use when you see the big aircraft coming in.
Yep.
And Phil, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. And we've all learned a lot today. And thank you very much.
Well, I hope so. Fire is a difficult concept for people who don't experience it. And for people, particularly those living in the country, really should light some fires under controlled conditions and look for themselves, and they will understand what we're talking about much better with a little bit of a demonstration fire in front of them.
Thank you, Phil. We're doing this for all of you. If you like what we're doing, please give us a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment below. See you next time.